Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Japan Foundation Touring Film Program's Associate Talk. My name is Junko Takeka, Senior Arts Program Officer of Japan Foundation London, and I'm responsible for the programming content. Our annual touring film program is coming to end, and so is this talk series. For this year, marking the program's 20th anniversary, we have included films that may prompt you to consider how Japanese cinema has been evolving, in particular in the 21st century, although we are totally aware that the limited selection isn't a true representation of Japanese cinema. Complementing our film selection and in conjunction with the program theme, in this final online talk, we have invited 5 speakers from Japan and the UK to explore and expand the landscape of Japanese cinema, posing a question of whether or not it has indeed been evolving. I am therefore delighted to welcome Himbara Yuka, film critic and journalist from Japan, Ishizaka Kenji, senior programmer for Tokyo International Film Festival, Julian Ross, film curator who served for many international festivals, James Mudge, film producer, director, writer, as a panelist for this roundtable discussion, and then Espen Bear from British Film Institute as a moderator. Thank you all for your time. As you can imagine, it is such a broad yet fundamental subject, so the next 1 hour will be nowhere near enough. However, I sincerely hope that this talk session will provide you further food of thought to consider where Japanese cinema came from and then where it is heading for. Next, housekeeping matters. Today's event will be recorded. As we are using the webinar function, your names will not be viewable by other attendees. However, I strongly recommend you to keep your audio or video muted throughout, just in case. If you have any question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function to send in your question at any time. Remember that attendees' question may be seen by everyone else, so that you can upvote particular question placed by another person, which you would like answered, or if it is the same as yours. Simply click the thumb up icon next to the question you wish to upvote. Unfortunately, due to the time restrictions, we may not be able to pick up all of the questions you asked, so my apologies in advance. Lastly, as always, we will send you an online questionnaire, so please spare a short moment to complete it for our future event. That's all from me. Now, I'd like to invite all the panelists and the moderator onto the screen. Over to you. お願いします。
Hello and very warm welcome to this roundtable. Just a brief overview of the structure. As I'm sure a lot of you have thought already, it's potentially a vast topic. So in order to kind of focus it for this hour session, we will initially be looking at the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s for about 10 to 15 minutes. Then moving on to the 90s, same 10 to 15 minutes. And finally, looking at the 21st century and contemporary developments for another 10 to 15 minutes, which I know in particular Himbara-san is very keen to discuss. So without any further ado, we will begin on the 1950s and potentially what is considered largely as the golden era of Japanese cinema. So I'd like to invite Ishizaka-san to maybe recommend a film or a director that you think is emblematic of particular developments from that period.
Hmm. はい、石坂です。そうですね、まあ、ちょっとね、テーマが大きいので、まあ、日本映画の戦後の黄金時代ですね、これは1945年に戦争が終わって、その後日本は、7年間アメリカ中心にした連合国に占領されるんですが、それが解けた後、つまり国際社会に復帰した後、様々な名作がどっと現れてきます。黒沢、小津、溝口、成瀬、もう皆さんご存知の名作が一気に けども、意外と私は100年後とか200年後に残ってるのは、ゴジラではないかという気がしています。
Hello, I'm Ishizaka, and as you say, this is a very broad theme. The post-war era of Japanese film is, as you say, what we call the golden era. The war ended in 1945, and then the next 7 years were a period of US occupation for Japan. But after that, when Japan is reclaiming its place in international society, is when we see this wave of prolific filmmakers, Kenji Mizoguchi, Yasujiro Ozu, Akira Kurosawa, Mika Narase, all coming in this era. But the film that has really stuck around for the next 100, maybe 200 years is Godzilla.
というのは、つまりですね、この反核とか反戦のメッセージ、これは、相変わらず戦争が終わらない、戦争がなくならない世界にあっては、やっぱり永遠のテーマになってますし、それからこの、核水爆で大きくなった怪物というテーマ、この想像力のやっぱり衝撃は、この何度もシリーズ化され、日本以外でもリメイクされるという影響の大きさを考えると、意外にゴジラが起こっていくんじゃないかということです。以上です。
This anti-war, anti-nuclear theme is, I think, one that will be around as long as the world continues to see wars taking place. And this theme of a monster created or through nuclear radiation, I think, is something that will keep going, and we've seen it being made into series, being remade, and that will, I dare say, continue.
Great, I believe, thank you for that. I think, James, you also highlighted Godzilla as one of the key films of the 1950s. So maybe you could, expand on that and talk about maybe from a Western point of view. These are universal themes, but they might have different resonances in the West.
Sure, absolutely. And I completely agree with everything said about Godzilla there. And I think one of the other sides, why I think it's so important, not just about the themes, which are, as you say, very, very universal themes, and also the fact that it launched all these franchises, series in Japan and around the world. But I think one of the other things which is so important about Godzilla, and one of the reasons why it represents this period of Japanese cinema so much, is I think it really became one of those gateway films, I think, for Western audiences in getting into not just Japanese cinema, but into world cinema as well. It's kind of like, martial arts films in the 70s for a lot of people. Even for myself, growing up in the 1990s, one of the first exposures to Japanese cinema or world cinema would be something like Godzilla, even though it's dubbed into English and might have Raymond Burr turning up in it and everything. It's still this sort of gateway, this first step, because you're still seeing a film which is looks different to a Western film. It's got a different, it's from a different country, different ethnicity of the cast. It's got some themes which are similar and some themes which are treated in a very different way. So I think Godzilla and all of the kaiju films which followed it, I think playing that kind of gateway role to Japanese cinema is very important. And that's probably one of the other reasons why it's endured so long. I'm pretty sure there'll be a lot of people who are still, maybe like genre fans rather than cinephiles, who are still discovering Japanese cinema through the old Godzilla films. Especially maybe they see one of the Hollywood ones first, then they go back and they'll see where it started, and that will maybe provide like a way into Japanese cinema for them.
I think that's a very good point about this idea of it being a gateway into wider Japanese film culture. And I may have got this slightly wrong, but I remember there was, because Ishiro Honda, the director, knew Kurosawa, and although Kurosawa obviously is regarded, understandably, as one of the great Japanese directors, certainly abroad as well as in Japan, I think he remarked to Honda about how his film was the one that people would maybe remember and kind of gravitate towards, even sometimes in Japan, and the way that he was able to deal with those issues in a relatively commercial and accessible manner. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And Kimbara-san, Dozo, would you like to add to any?
そうですね。私もお話しいただいたときに、ゴジラをやっぱり入れて、ゴジラは外せない映画かなと思ったんですけど、ゴジラの話をばかりしてもあれなので、違う話をしようかなと思うんですけど、私が1990年代に取材を始めたときに、是枝裕和監督や、岩井俊二監督や、橋口亮介監督やっていう、若い20代、30代の監督が一斉に出てきたんですけど、それは日本映画が焼け野原になって商業的にもうかなり苦しくなった時に、青山真司監督だったりが出てきて、その時皆さんすごくパーソナルリーチっていう、すごく自分の手の届く範囲のことを、自分の眼を大切に世界に届けるっていうことをされてたと思うんですけど、その時ただいろんな監督が参考としてよく名前を出していたのが今村昌平さんだったり、深作欣二さんだったり、自分のすごく切実な問題をものすごくカメラで接近するみたいな、そこら辺がリンクしていたのかなと思います。すごくそういう意味では深作欣二監督の仁義なき戦いってすごい薬剤映画とも思われるんですけど、眼差しっていう点では時代の監督たちにすごい重要な作品だったのかなと思っています。
Yeah, so when you asked me these questions initially, I put Godzilla on my list as well, but we can't just spend all evening talking about Godzilla. So I'll talk a bit about when I started out in the 90s. This was when we had a wave of new young directors coming out: KORE-EDA, Iwai Shunji, Hashiguchi. Lots, and it had been a bit of a dead period, and then we saw a new wave of directors coming out who had a very personal viewpoint and were showing their own world. And a lot of them, when they were starting out, referred back to Kenji Fukusaku and Imamura and people like this. And they would refer back to Fukusaku's Yakuza films, which we think of as Yakuza films, but in terms of their viewpoint and the way they looked at the world, it's actually something that the newer directors were referring back to.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting point about you mentioned Jingi Naki Tatakai or Battles Without Honor and Humanity, as it's known in English. I think it actually ties in very well with Godzilla without going back to Godzilla. In its focus on this idea of the repercussions of the nuclear bomb in Japan, but on a more societal level rather than a sort of scientific level. And again, I know James and Ishizaki-san also highlighted that as a particularly important film from that period. So yes, I also wanted to bring in Julian as well here. So I noticed that you obviously picked up on Oshima, who was a contemporary of Imamura, and maybe you'd like to add a little bit about maybe some of the themes, the way in which those more experimental and the new wave, the Nobuo Nobunaga films maybe tie in, and some of the more experimental works tie in with that period of post-war Japanese cinema.
Okay, sure. Hello, everybody. Really nice to be here in conversation with all of you on screen. I wrote down Nagisa Oshima as an influential figure from the 1960s, I would say. I was thinking more his kind of post-studio filmmaking, or his independent filmmaking, and later in co-production with the Art Theatre Guild of Japan. I thought his bravery of leaving his studio and launching into independent filmmaking really brought about a new era of Japanese cinema into the 1960s and beyond. Apart from that, I think, frankly speaking, a lot of Japanese cinema can be quite formulaic still today. So I wanted to mention Oshima as an antithesis, a filmmaker who challenges himself to do something else for each film, whether that means a different theme or a different filmmaking style. This is something that Oshima has done, Oshima did throughout his career, and maybe it's more that I hope that part of his filmmaking would continue to be influential in contemporary cinema today in Japan and beyond. I wrote down a couple of other films, but they're in the 1970s, so I don't know if it's the right moment to mention that, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, you had Matsumoto's Ant-Man and a couple of others, so yeah, please do if you'd like to, because they're really interesting films.
Okay, yes,
love of
sure.
mine, so yeah, please do. Yeah.
So I thought I'd choose one documentary and one experimental film, because I thought maybe we'll be talking about a lot of fiction films, and that's the main reason. But I'll start with Ant-Man by Toshio Matsumoto, which is a short experimental film made in 1975. There's not really a story or anything. It's more of an experience. A quick succession of still images that circle around this figure who's sat in a field wearing a hanya mask, like a no theater mask. And the different color schemes, the jump cuts, the speed at which we go from one still image to the next, that creates this roller coaster-like experience. I think this film really influenced and still continues to influence Japanese experimental films. For example, in the 80s with Takashi Spacey, probably one of the most famous Japanese experimental films. And I believe he was a student of Matsumoto as well. And their students also making short films. I still watch Japanese experimental films made today that draw a clear influence from, Ant-Man and Spacey. So I thought I'd mention it there. Because Japanese cinema has a rich history of experimental film. And the other film I thought I'd mention is Extreme Private Eros Love Song, 1974 by Kazuo Hara, which I think was, quite a groundbreaking documentary for its kind of raw intimacy and pointing a camera to your immediate surroundings for your documentary. It's a film where Kazuo Hara visits his ex-girlfriend, MIIKE Takeda, who's a feminist living in Okinawa, together with his then and also now partner, Sachiko Kobayashi, who's a sound recordist. Obviously that's kind of situation is a source of tension, but that becomes the subject of the film. And I see that kind of personal documentary still a lot in Japanese cinema, especially in the 90s and 2000s, where yourself and also your family, your partner, surroundings becomes the subject of a documentary. I think this is one of the first that really tackled the subject in this way. Yeah, really great documentary.
That's great, thank you, and it brings us nicely on to, well, in a couple of ways, but you mentioning the 90s brings us on. We can start sort of heading in that direction, particularly as well because also you obviously talking about a Kazuo Hara film, and Ijizaka-san had picked out actually the film to do with the 90s is actually from the late 80s, but it's Yuki Yukite Shingun, or The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, which is actually relatively well known now even in the UK and the US, despite being only one of hundreds of incredible documentaries that were made in Japan really from the 60s up until the sort of late 80s by Ogawa Pro and various others. So yeah, I'd like to invite I'm happy to go with whoever. I mean, whoever wants here, or Ishizaka-san again. Would you like to talk a little bit about Yuki Shingun?
はい。たまたまですね、私も70年代の深作金次仁義なき戦いと、80年代原和夫雪新軍を、ゴジラの後に挙げたんですけれども、割合私の関心っていうのは、その戦後の日本をきちんと描いた映画というのがどういうものがあるかということに関心がありまして、もちろんゴジラはさっき言った通りなんですけれども、仁義なき戦いもさっきエスペンさんおっしゃったように、キノコ雲から始まる映画ですけれども、これもまあ言ってみれば、戦争が終わって帰っ ってきた復員兵ですよね。戻ってきた兵隊がもう居場所がなくて、黒社会、闇の社会に入っていくという、話なわけで、やはり痛烈な、反戦でもあり、戦後批判でもあるということで言うと、原和夫の雪吹進軍というのは、もう、80年代の後半になってですね、日本には元号というのがあって、つまり天皇が在位しているが変わると、天皇が変わると、その元号も変わるというのがあってですね、これ、つまり昭和という、時代の終わりに、原和夫のこの、言ってみれば戦争と戦後を総括するような、雪吹進軍が出たというのが、私の中ではゴジラ、仁義なき戦い、雪吹進軍というのがこの昭和の象徴のようなラインで非常につながってる感じがいたします。
So I actually wrote down the film that's just come up, or that Espen mentioned, that Kimura-san mentioned, Battles Without Honor and Humanity. That was on my list. And as you say, The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On was also on my list, as well as Godzilla. And because I'm interested in films that show what Japan, post-war Japan was like. And of course, Godzilla does that, but I'm not going to talk anymore about that film. But Battles Without Honor and Humanity, Fukusaki Kinji's film, starts with the mushroom cloud. And it features demobilized soldiers who come back to Japan and don't have anywhere to go, really. So they find themselves in the underground world. And it's a kind of anti-war, anti-post-war movie. And then with The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, we have in Japan era names that use the name of the emperor, and they define an era. And this film was made right at the end of the Showa era, which is an era that sort of covers the war and the post-war period in Japan. And so The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, I think, is one that encapsulates and represents the whole of this Showa era.
一言だけ付け加えると、もう一本昭和の終わりに非常に象徴的な絵があってですね、私の考えでは、それは隣のトトロなんですけれども、これも昭和の戦後の時代を描いてますけれども、雪吹って進軍と合わせてみると、この、ノスタルジックなこのトトロと、それからもうその、軍隊の闇の部分を描いたこれぜひ2本立てで見ると、この日本の元号と特にその昭和という時代のことがよくわかるんではないか。
Another film, I think, made around the same time, that at the end of the Showa period, that really represents the period, is My Neighbor Totoro. And I think these make a very interesting double bill. You have the nostalgia of the Showa era with Totoro, and then in The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On, you have this dark side of the army being depicted, a very interesting double bill representative of the Showa era.
Yes, I agree. I think it is a very interesting, although probably not a double bill that many people have thought of, but it's a very interesting one, and it's also important to note for people that aren't aware that my maths is correct. The Showa era ended actually in January 1989, so it's roughly kind of leading straight into the 1990s. I wondered maybe just mentioning Tonari no Totoro, My Neighbor Totoro, and bringing us into Studio Ghibli and animation. That links quite nicely in with the 90s, because certainly from a Western point of view, that was a period at which, another wave of, film fans became aware of a certain aspect of Japanese cinema, whether it was through Akira or Ghost in the Shell or Kokoku Kidotei, and Ninja Scroll and a few of these others. So yeah, maybe apologies, I know these weren't on your list, James, but maybe you'd like to say a little bit about maybe the Western reception of how these changed a view on Japanese cinema.
Sure. I mean, as you mentioned, like, you know, Akira and Ghost in the Shell were, you know, and again, speaking from my own experience, that was absolutely the first time I really became aware of not just Japanese animation, but because of when I saw them, I'd say it was also one of those times where I really became aware of Japanese science fiction at the same time as well. So they kind of tie back a bit to that. What I was saying before, like you know, another sort of gateway thing, and I think Akira and Ghost in the Shell definitely are. I mean, I'm not so much the sort of the Ghibli fan myself, but from Ghost in the Shell and Akira, I didn't really go into becoming an anime fan, but it did push me a lot more into Japanese cinema, and I think both of those films they tie into so many sort of wider issues. And at the time, I would fully admit that when I saw them firstly, I would have thought like cartoons being cartoons. So these were the first times which I actually saw like an animation film tackling serious subjects properly, which is something at the time I hadn't seen in Western cinema growing up as well. So for me, I thought those were, in terms of my own perception, and I think for a lot of people probably of my age, that those were real perception changers, both of animation cinema and again of Japanese cinema, because they're not just fantastically imaginative, but just the animation style as well, how detailed they are. They're so evocative and beautiful, as well as tying into being both sort of futuristic concerns, but also some very sort of contemporary anxieties as well. So absolutely, yeah.
No, thank you. And obviously, you know, as it's probably been noted many times, I mean, films like The Matrix, you know, owe almost their entire DNA, as it were, to films such as Ghost in the Shell.
Definitely.
So yeah, and but sticking sort of within the 90s, but in a sort of very different mood of film to the Ghiblis. Kimbada-san, you highlighted Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Cure as one of your kind of like key films of the 90s, which again is one of my absolute favorites as well. So maybe you'd like to speak a little bit about that and how it maybe Kurosawa himself links, you know, ties in with some of the developments in 90s Japanese cinema. Thank you.
やっぱり黒沢さんっていうのはちょっと時代を予見していたっていうすごく理不尽な暴力性がある日突然身の回りにやってきて、それはもう逃れようもないっていう、すごい人間のものすごく残酷な運命みたいなのを予見していて、それが何かこう、サスペンス調に何か予兆するみたいもなく唐突にやってきて、死もものすごく唐突に終わるみたいな、そういうこう、避けようもない恐怖みたいなものを先駆けて描いた監督だと思うんですね。ですからすごくそこにはなんかものすごいエモーショナルな何かこう、恍惚するものも何もないっていう、むしろその鮮烈でみんなを映画的な空間に永遠に閉じ込めてしまって、カーテンが揺れるだけで何か来るんじゃないかっていう私たちがなんかもう呪いにかけられてるような、で、それはなんかすごく面白いというか、みんなの心の中の廃墟っていうものをなんか掘り下げた方なのかなと思います。で、さっき石田さんがやっぱ昭和っていうことをすごくおっしゃってて、私、黒沢清監督はカリスマっていう映画、一本の木を残すか残さないかってすごく大騒ぎして、討議するものなんですけど、当時公開された時に青山真治監督と、一本の木を、あれを、環境のものと見ずに、日本社会における天皇制って見たら、ものすごく面白いよねっていう話をしたことがありますね。なんかそういう、なんか捉え方もできるのかなとは思っています。
すいません。
はい。ごめんなさい。はい。はい。はい。はい。
Yes, so Kiyoshi Kurosawa, a director who inflicts on us this absurd violence from which there is no escape, and has his characters facing a very, very cruel fate without even an element of suspense. Sometimes it's just visited on them very suddenly, as is death, and leaves us with this sense of unescapable fear that keeps us locked into the films. It's almost a curse to watch a Kurosawa Kiyoshi film, because you find yourself watching every twitch of the curtain. I think he really managed to plumb the depths of our hearts to create that kind of response.
はい、カリスマのは一本の木を残すか残さないかっていう話なんですけど、あれを当時上映された時に青山真治監督と、あれを日本における天皇制と見たらすごく見方が変わるよねっていう話をしたことがあります。それぐらいなんかいろんな解釈が成り立つ映画を黒沢さんは作ってるなといつも思います。
And then the other interesting one, charisma, with this 木って鳥の木で、of whether to leave this tree or not. And I remember when that came out, Aoyama Shinji saying, well, if you think of that as being the imperial system, then actually it's a very interesting idea. And so I think Kurosawa's films are actually films that you can also interpret in a variety of interesting ways.
Thank you. Yes, no, I think I agree. I think there's his playing around with genre, but also raising some quite intense, interesting, I should say, topics and moods through sort of genre cinema in the 90s is interesting. And I know we haven't got a huge amount of time before we did move on to the 21st century, but I thought I'd just quickly pass back to James very quickly, because I know you mentioned Kiyoshi Kurosawa as an important figure, you know, and how he was one of the kind of trailblazers, certainly for Western audiences, I think, for that period, along with MIIKE and others that we haven't discussed yet. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really interesting things about Kiyoshi Kurosawa is kind of like looking not just his 90s work, but kind of where the trajectory of his career. And we're going to get into talking about the 21st century more, but especially looking at his horror films, which are definitely horror, but they are more abstract, but which come before like the whole post-Ring Japanese horror boom. So I think his films are quite different. I mean, we were talking about there that sort of sense of dread of being cursed, almost like an proper existential dread and terror of everything without it even necessarily being able to put a name to it. But then when we get to the post-Ring sort of boom and stuff, I liked how he kind of adapted his style to that in the early 2000s with stuff like Pulse or, you know, Cairo, which I think is probably the best of that, you know, not Ring ripoffs, but Ring inspired films, you know, shall we say, because I think Ring is another film which really changed the film industry, both in Japan and internationally. But I think the way his career goes from there as well, after he does like Tokyo Sonata, and then starts becoming more of a sort of fixture on the international film festival circuit. So it's such a fascinating career he has from that 90s period all the way through to today.
No, absolutely. On a slight sort of tangent before we move off this bit, I just wanted to bring Gillian in again, because we sort of leave off where we were picked up with this, is the idea of documentary. And you highlighted a couple of documentaries, Atarashi Kami-sama being one, The New God, which is a great film, and the other one, which I haven't seen yet, actually, but I just wondered if about the Omshin Rikyo. It's been on my list for years, still not got around to it, but yes, I thought just wondered if you wanted to say a few words about or a bit, you know, about those films.
Sure. Actually, I wanted to say that Emperor's Naked Army Marches On is available on DVD in the UK for that second run release. So people should check that amazing release out. And I love the idea of a double bill between Totoro and this film. I think I'll have to do that one day. But yeah, I mentioned these two documentaries as kind of a new chapter in Japanese documentary filmmaking, I suppose, from the personal to kind of having the bravery to go into a space where you might not agree with the people that you speak with. Your documentary subjects might be very different people to you, but these filmmakers nevertheless kind of enter into that space. And I wanted to kind of highlight the yeah, the courage that it takes to make documentaries in general, but especially in this kind of environment. So The New God is a documentary made about a right-wing, like a nationalist punk band, and particularly its singer. And eventually the filmmaker and her kind of really connect and I think develop a relationship after the film even. So yeah, kind of a surprise development there. But A is a documentary by Tatsuya Mori, who's an amazing documentary filmmaker who basically goes into the Om Shinrikyo cult, right, after their sarin gas attack in the Tokyo subway in 1995. The film was released in 1998, and kind of has this amazing inside view of like the aftermath of that incident and the kind of falling apart of the cult, and especially the kind of PR person who's like a 20-something-year-old spokesman. Yeah, so again, these two films just bring about a different approach to documentary, from focusing on the self to like completely the opposite, and that's why I thought I'd mention it. The 90s is one of my favorite eras of Japanese cinema, but it was difficult for me to say which one was the most influential. I just felt there were so many great films that came out at that time, each really individually different. So yeah, I stuck with the documentary strand.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree, actually. I think in many aspects, whether it's some of the more prestige pieces like Kitano Takeshi's films like Hanabi and some that went on to win prizes, or Imamura's Unagi or The Eel, to the sort of more experimental stuff, like you were saying about Ito. Takashi does some of his best work, or some of his great work is in the 90s. And I agree, I think the 90s is a really interesting period of filmmaking in Japan. So yeah, no, thank you for that. Does anyone have any maybe sort of final comments on any aspect of the 90s they'd like to make before we move on to the more contemporary? Oh yes, Ishizaka-san, どうぞ。
いや、すごく面白い議論になってて、つまりね、金原さんは90年代まで廃墟だったっておっしゃったんですね。で、一方でその国際的にやはり知られている日本映画っていうのがこの時代に出ていて、清黒沢、北野武、三池隆とか、ね、ここのギャップが実はすごく面白いなと話を聞いていて思いました。
Yeah, I think what struck me as interesting is that Kimbara-san referred to Japanese cinema before the 1990s as being in ruins. And then here we see all these directors, filmmakers coming out who are going to go on to be internationally famous, like Kiyoshi Kurosawa, like Takeshi Miike, like Takeshi. And I find that a very interesting gap.
で、ちなみにどういうことかって考えると、これまたちょっと言語になるんですが、この時代平成っていう言語なんですね。で、これはついこの間まで30年続いたんですけれども、この平成っていうふうに区切られた30年は何の時代かというと、一つはその大きな災害が何回もあったという天災害ですね。でもう一つはカルト宗教の問題というのが特に90年代にあって、これは黒沢清のキュアとかですね、非常に深い部分で、それから A はもちろん直接それを描いたドキュメンタリーですけども、だからその日本人の心に、非常にこの災害と、そのなんか生存的な不安みたいなものが植え付けられたのがこの平成の時代だったんではないかと。でそれを描いた映画というのは逆に、世界で、非常にこうなんか普遍的なものとして、評価されたんではないかという。この日本にいた時のこのなんか落ち目の感じというかですね、日本社会が夕日で夕暮れていくような感じと、 一方で日本映画が国際的に評価されていくという、そういうギャップだったんじゃないかなと、今、皆さんの話を聞いて思いました。
And I think it comes down again partly to era names. The period we're talking about now is during the Heisei era, which has recently come to an end, but it was 30 years. And during that 30 years, we saw a number of natural disasters. We saw the problem of these cults in Japan, especially in the 1990s. And as well as the documentary that Julian was talking about, which is a documentary directly about Shinrikyo, Cure also ties into this as well. And I think that the fear and sense of existential unease that Japanese people felt during this period is something that is reflected in the films of the period, and something that has struck a chord internationally as being quite universal. And so I think the contrast between the sun setting, if you like, on Japanese society, but also at the same time rising on Japanese film, which is gaining international momentum, is a very interesting one.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I think if we're probably just about coming towards the end of the last section, I should say, sorry, of the round table, and then we will open up for questions just before 2, hopefully. But so I'd like to invite Kimbara-san. I know you're particularly interested in contemporary film, so maybe you could please start this part of the discussion with some observations or some particular key films or filmmakers that you'd like to highlight. Soどうぞ。
そうですね。今、石崎さんが日本がすごく2000年以降いろんなものを失われていく年だったんで、そういうものはすごく如実に現れる作家たちが今増えていると思います。で、皆さんよくご存知のように濱口竜介監督や深田晃司監督、喪失の後の何もないものからの再生というものはお二人ずっと描いている監督かなと思うんですけど、私は今年の作品で荻上直子監督がまさに新興宗教にはまる主婦の話をとっていて、すごく面白いので、どこか皆さんで何か国際映画祭で見る機会があったら非常にいいなと思っています。はい、ハモンです。
Yeah, that's really interesting what Ichisaka-san was saying about this sense of loss in Japanese society and the new filmmakers coming out. And nowadays, everyone has heard of Hamaguchi Ryusuke and Fukuda Koji, who are filmmakers who deal with this sense of loss and rebuilding after loss. But for me, one filmmaker that I would like people to pay attention to is Okigami Naoko, and her new film Hamon, which is about a couple who get drawn into a new religion. And so if that does end up in international film festivals, then I encourage people to watch it.
Thank you. Does someone else have any observations on contemporary trends or anything that they've seen maybe on one festival circuit that's or maybe now's a good time to discuss the different sort of reactions of because I know there's a couple of people here are involved or have been involved with international film festivals, so maybe maybe Julian, you'd like to add a little bit about the different reception of, say, Western audiences, or at least non-Japanese audiences towards Japanese films, and what is maybe more likely to get admission to a festival as opposed to what might be actually interesting to Japanese audiences, whether big or small.
Sure. I mean, if you look at the top 10 box office hits in Japan, they're mostly anime, and there's sequels of Conan and One Piece and this kind of thing. So, I mean, some of that travels to international film festivals and theatrical releases abroad, but I guess there is a gap there of what we get to see outside of Japan and in Japan. Of course, Japan remains to this day one of the most prolific national cinemas in the world. So there's a lot that I think we don't get to see. But you know, for many years I was programming Japanese films for international film festivals, and yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, there was a lot of quite formulaic cinema. So I almost had a joke with some of my colleagues that I can bet that this film is going to start with an establishing shot and some piano playing, and then there'll be a title card, and you know, 80% of the time that would be the case. So as a programmer, researcher, writer of Japanese film, I always want to champion cinema and filmmakers who are daring to explore different kind of film language, whether that means narrative structure, that means filmmaking style. And thankfully, there are lots of filmmakers in Japan that, do try that out. So yeah, like I particularly am fond of Kaori Oda, a documentary filmmaker who makes really sensory documentaries, whether that means going into the mines or into the water. She finds a really kind of daring, free form style of documentary filmmaking, which is more about an experience of being in a place than translating like all this information to a different public. So I find her filmmaking really great. And actually, speaking of Nagisa Oshima earlier, there's been the Oshima Nagisa Award that was inaugurated a couple of years ago. She won the first one. Actually, I think the first time they tried to give an award, they decided nobody was worthy, which is quite an interesting statement, you know, which said a lot about the state of Japanese cinema. I think they basically said nobody's worthy of this Oshima Award, but yeah, since they've awarded it to Kaori Oda, Akio Fujimoto, Juichiro Yamasaki, who made Yamaguchi. Yeah, they're wonderful filmmakers. I mean, it's as it is in many countries, it's difficult to make films in Japan, and the production committee system makes it difficult for a director to kind of have an individual voice, kind of to be an author in a system like that, where there's so many different companies and organizations and agencies putting money into a project and wanting, having their own specific agendas. So I wanted to mention Koji Fukada, who I believe, not just for his films really, but for his kind of activism around his community. He's been a really vocal supporter of, a better system for Japanese independent filmmaking, particularly for women, a better working environment, a healthier working environment, especially during the pandemic. He, I think, started with others this Arts Workers Japan organization to help independent filmmakers in a time of pandemic. So, it's really great to have somebody like him, who's a renowned filmmaker internationally, using his platform to critique how it is at the moment in Japan in terms of filmmaking, and searching with others for a healthier and different kind of environment that will bring about space for independent and artistic voices in Japanese cinema.
Yes, no, thank you. And I think it's interesting you mentioned about the space, because I know the sadly now defunct, although you can still view it online, the Midnight Eye website, they sort of ceased publishing that because they felt that there wasn't enough coming out of the kind of films that they wanted to cover. Although I think, Julian, you did contribute to it, so you may know a bit more about why it was wrapped up. But I think it's that's an interesting idea about the problems of finding spaces for maybe more independent-minded filmmakers, and it reminds me of the fact that some of maybe the most well-known filmmakers from the earlier bit of the sort of 21st century with KORE-EDA and Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who we've talked about, but also Kawase Naomi as well. They've really, particularly in Kawase Naomi's case, they've had to really look abroad for funding and get a lot of funding from, particularly in France, and the actual reception to their films is in places like France at the Cannes Festival is much greater in proportion to maybe how they're received at home for a variety of reasons. So yeah, I'm not sure if anyone wants to pick up on that, or if anyone has any other observations that they'd like to make on this period. Sorry, yeah, of course, Julian, yeah, please do.
Maybe I can just quickly say that, yeah, it says something that I guess many of the even established Japanese filmmakers are going abroad in places like Korea to make their films. I think it speaks to the difficulties of making original films in Japan, and you know, the possibility of a better system that is currently in place in other places. Yeah. So yeah, Broker by KORE-EDA. I think Drive My Car was supposed to be shot mostly in Korea. I think now, because of the pandemic, it became only a little bit. And Love Life, Gara's Love Life also features long scenes in Korea as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
いいですか？
Yeah, hi, Kimbara-san.
はい。やっぱり日本は大きな大手の映画会社は、その若手の育成っていうのを残念ながらしていない現状があるので、まあ、自主制作からなんとか生き残った人をうまくピックアップするみたいな感じなので、そのインディペンデントで頑張らなくちゃいけないのは、もう各映画フィルムメーカーがすごい一生懸命頑張ってる形になってしまってるんですね。ただやっぱりみんなと話してるんですけど、その中でもやっぱり多国籍制ですごく頑張ってる日本の監督たちはすごく多くて、例えば富田克也さんみたいにク族ってタイと日本を行ったり来たりして撮ってたり、逆にリム・カーワイ監督やエドワード・ヨー監督みたいにアジアから日本に来る。それから日本で撮っているインド人としてアンシェル・チューハン監督がいるっていうふうに、まあ、これらも日本映画と今言ってもいいのではないかみたいな、ちょっと面白い現状にはなってると思います。
Yeah, it's true that the big film studios in Japan don't put much effort into supporting nurturing young talent and young filmmakers, and so the ones who go on to be successful are the ones who have started out independently and survived, and gone on to be picked up. So they've worked really hard, but there are people who do that. There are people who and people who, as you say, work. Go back and forth between Japan and other countries, Tomita Kazuya. And then you have directors from overseas who come into Japan from India, for example, and also like Langkawai and directors like that. So it's an interesting trend.
Sorry. Either Ishizaka-san and James, or James and then Ishizaka-san.
付け加えますと、まさにそうなんですね。なんていうんですか、エスニシティのバラエティみたいなことなんですけども、韓国映画が今すごく面白いっていうのは、やっぱり見てると、韓国人とは何かとか、韓国とは何かみたいな、そういう非常に切実なテーマが、エンターテインメントの中にもあるのが大きな魅力だと思っていて、で日本映画の場合ですね、そういうことを教えてくれるのは、むしろ、今名前が出た、方々の映画だったり、つまりその外からの目線みたいなね、日本社会をもう一つ回り外から見直すみたいなことを、私たちに教えてくれるということで、すごく面白いと思います。で、一人付け加えると、先ほど大島渚アワードの話が出ましたけど、 藤本明夫監督ですね。日本に住むミャンマー人の話を取ったり、それから日本に来てやはり過酷な労働をさせられているベトナム人女性の話を取ったりというふうに、非常にこう、社会を相対化して、描いていて、大島渚賞をやはり受賞したんですけれども、こういった興味深い監督がいることは事実です。ですよ。
藤本明夫監督のタイトルが Along the Sea です。
はい。Yeah, the ethnic variety now is really interesting. As Kimbara-san was saying, what's interesting with Korean films is that even in their films that are mass market entertainment, they deal with things like, what does it mean to be Korean? What is Korea? But with Japanese films, it's actually some of these non-Japanese directors who are showing us what Japan is, what it means to be Japanese, and they're casting a light from outside Japan, like some of the directors that Kimbara-san mentioned just now. And also going back to the Oshima Nagisa Prize, another director who's won that is Fujimoto Akio, with films like Along the Sea, looking at Burmese people in Japan, looking at a Vietnamese woman doing manual labor in Japan. A very interesting director casting light on different parts of society.
Wonderful, thank you, thank you. And I think we've just got a time for one more contribution. So James, if you'd like to, if you have a final observation, you'd like to wrap up, and then we'll move on to the questions. I think if that's okay with everyone.
Sure.
Okay, great. Yes, please go ahead.
I mean, I was mainly going to say that, and this is kind of coming from almost like a mainstream perspective or a commercial perspective. So from like bigger film festivals in the UK and Europe, and what gets distributed or what gets released at the moment. I mean, as Julian said, there's a lot of anime, and it does make it into cinemas here. It just doesn't get covered at all by the Western media. It's just there. Like at my Cineworld at the moment, I can guarantee there'll be like 1 or 2 playing. But I'm not really sure what audiences they're pitching it to. And then aside from that, the only other Japanese films really coming out are the the KORE-EDA films, or the other. We kind of have this sort of tier of Japanese directors who have, they're Japanese directors. They've almost kind of transcended into this kind of international festival circuit of directors who every time they make a film, it's going to appear at most of the big festivals, and it's going to get picked up by someone like MUBI or one of the slightly like commercial art house labels here in the UK and stuff. So what I'm not really seeing in Japanese cinema at the moment, in terms of what I'm not seeing here in the UK or getting pitched to me in the media or festivals, is stuff, maybe some of the stuff Julian's talking about, some of the more interesting experimental stuff. There's not much genre stuff coming through at all. It's purely dramas, with people looking for another KORE-EDA style film, looking for another Drive My Car style film. So while it's great that these films are getting like international recognition and stuff, I'm not sure, it's not like a Ring or a Godzilla or anything, which is actually throwing open a perception for new audiences for Japanese cinema, because the cinephile audience will, as soon as a film plays like Cannes or wins at Cannes or Berlin, they're going to watch it anyway. It doesn't matter really which country it comes from. So I think it's both a time where it's great where we're seeing some of these films getting high profile festivals awards, but for me, that's kind of, it's not really bringing too much variety or too many opportunities for more interesting stuff, maybe.
Yes, no, thank you. And I agree. And I think there is something to be said about how, as you were saying about the certain types of film, it's reflected in many aspects of what is called world cinema, for want of a better term.
Yes.
A lot of the titles that get picked up from France or Germany or whatever is a very specific type of, dare I say, sort of middle-class, middle-brow sort of filmmaking, which is, maybe that's a bit unfair. That's not to say that those films don't necessarily have some interesting things to say, but it's a particular type, as you say, that will be picked up by particular distributors, because that's what they've carved their niche out there.
Exactly.
And so Great. No, thank you all very much. I think we've got some time for some questions. If everyone would like to, the top rated question on here is from a Jonathan Root. So it was following on from someone else's question I think you mentioned, but the going right back to the beginning, talking about Godzilla. And asking about, does this in fact make Japanese cinema very similar to contemporary Western trends in terms of long-running franchises and remakes? I'm not sure. Yes, not sure who would like to pick. Okay, yeah, sure. Julian, please, yeah.
Maybe just to say, I don't think it's also a long-running Japanese trait, right? Both in terms of cinema, but also in the other arts as well. There's a tradition of remaking familiar stories for new audiences, or even audiences who are familiar with the story. So yeah, I don't particularly think it's a Western trend that Japanese cinema has adopted. I just think it's been part of even before cinema with theater. I guess in Japan there's that idea that you don't have to be surprised by a story while you're watching the film. It's fine that you know about the story, and you are kind of watching how it's being presented on screen or on stage. So yeah, of course, I think it's primarily economic reasons that there's so many Godzillas, and there's long-running franchises like One Piece and Pokemon and all that. But yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's worth pointing out maybe for people in the UK, it's not very well known. I know it's got a little bit more circulation in the US, but there's the incredibly long-running Koro-san or Tokuwa Tsudayo series, which runs to about 45 films from the late 60s onwards. So yeah, this idea that it's maybe a Western trend is actually, as you were saying, it's very much a part of Japanese cinema, and of course things like The Burmese Heart was reshot in colour by Ichikawa Kon, the same director. So there is this trend of sometimes reshooting and updating films, for a contemporary audience. Even such as things like Tokyo Monogatari, I think, or Tokyo Story was shot recently for TV. Anyway, sorry. Yes. Anyone else like to? Yes, please. Yeah, James.
I'd just throw in quickly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's something which, I completely agree. Economic and practicality is a huge factor, just being able to reuse sets, being able to reuse costumes, everything. But it was something in the 50s, 60s, we were seeing in so many other countries as well, like in Hong Kong, like the Wong Fei-hung films, where they were making so many of those films in the 50s and 60s. And we've seen that being reshot, reinvented through, right through to the present day, but before stuff like Once Upon in China and everything. So, and I think you can see that in a lot of different countries. And I think partly it was just largely like a product of the time, where people, I think the way audiences approach films were quite different as well back then. I don't think people would accept it quite so much now. If you're churning out like 150 to 100 episodes in it now that we have our Netflixes and we have our series, which have kind of taken over from what that would have been. But yeah.
No, thank you. That's great. I've got a question here from Peter Blunden. This is actually, again, going back to the sort of the golden era. It's, sorry, I've lost it now. There we go. Was Kurosawa's Rashomon seen as a groundbreaking film in Japan, or was it only the Western world that saw it as revolutionary, as it was a film that really opened up, Japanese cinema to critics in Europe and the US? So yeah. Would anyone like to kick off on?
もちろんそう。
Okay.
Yeah, of course it was.
言ってもいいんですか？
はい、木村さん。はい。
はい。やっぱり羅生門っていうのは非常に一期的だと思うんですね。それは、複数の視点で物語を描くっていう、まさに今、マルチの、視線を大切にするっていうのが、技術的に可能になってるんですけど、ああいう映画の世界でそういうマルチ愛みたいなものをやったっていうのはすごく面白いと思います。それで、ジェンダーのこともあると思います。その男性側の言っている、 出来事と女性側から見る出来事のジェンダーギャップみたいな、それがハラスメントかそうでないかっていうことも、今の時代の予見する作品だったのかなというふうにも、まあ、美術的にも、すごく当時のゴールデンエイジのもうスタッフが、宮川和夫という撮影監督も素晴らしいっていう、まあ、本当に日本から見ても、映画いろんな意味で画期的な作品だと思います。舞台でも何度も日本も、未だに若い人が演じてます。
Yes, I mean Rashomon was groundbreaking in Japan as well. That telling a story from a multitude of different angles, something that we still do today. But the technical ability to be able to do that was really interesting at the time, and also its take on gender, the way that men and women see things differently, and is it harassment, is it not harassment, again, is something that's foreshadowed the world that we live in today. Also from the art point of view and the camera work by Kazuo Miyagawa, again, groundbreaking, and there are people still working with Rashomon today, stage versions, etc.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time just for one more question, and then unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up. So kind of bring it back to the sort of the contemporary. I've got a question here from Alec Macaulay, asking about the definitions. Definitions of boundaries of Japanese cinema being tested by the transnational. So just to sort of digest the question, there's talking about we talked briefly about non-Japanese filmmakers making films in Japan, and the question brings up people like Abbas Kiarostami, Isabelle Coixet, and Leo Carax, but also other smaller Japanese filmmakers such as non-Japanese filmmakers like Roger Pulvers, Don Williams, I think, who's lived in Japan for a long time, Mark Schilling, and people making films. So the question is, I'd like to hear what the panelists think of this current. Are they welcome or are they feared? Thank you. So I'm not sure who wants to lead on answering that.
発言されますか？
いや、すごく簡単で、もう私はもうすごいウェルカムで面白くてしょうがないと思って、その最初、こんな日本のイメージを取ってくれたんだと思ったのは、ソフィア・コッポラですね。いや、なんかもうぼんやりした日本を見たときに、これだよなと思いました。それから、今、アジアの監督たちもいろんな、ね日本に来てロケをするようになってきてるんだけども、もう、じゃんじゃん来て、こっちからも、日本からも行って、もう、じゃんじゃん交流するといいと思います。
I think they're very welcome, and they're producing fascinating work. The first time that I was aware of this was with Sofia Coppola, this external view of Japan. There are a lot of Asian directors now coming to shoot in Japan, and I hope that it continues, and I hope that we have a lively exchange of Japanese directors going outside Japan as well.
付け加えていいですか？
はい。
ポン・ジュノ監督が日本に来て、短編を撮った時に助監督についていた片岡信三っていう監督が、すごく影響を受けて、すごくその人の心に切り込むような作家性を作って今年探すっていう映画を作ったんですけど、去年。それ日本映画監督協会の新人賞を授与されていたので、やっぱりすごくそういう外部から来た方の刺激っていうのはとても大きいのではないかと思います。
I'd like to add that Kataoka Shinzo, who was the assistant director when Bong Joon-ho came to Japan to make a short film, really was influenced by Bong Joon-ho and is making work that really cuts to the heart. And last year made a film called Sagasu, which won the Newcomers Award in Japan. And so it's really important. It's the influence of these non-Japanese directors and filmmakers.
すいません、片山晋三監督です。ちょっと言い間違えてしまいました。片山晋三です。
Sorry, I got his name wrong. It was Katayama Shinzo.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I think that's unfortunately we've got time for, but it's been great. It's been wonderful to hear everyone's contributions, and I think we've probably only really touched the surface, but I think I hope we've done a good, I think we've done a very good job of covering various key trends and hopefully given people lots of different avenues of Japanese cinema to explore, whilst touching on the more kind of well-known films. Yes, thank you everyone, and thank you for attending as well.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting discussion. I didn't want to end it, but as a timekeeper, I have to stop at some point because some people may actually be watching it over lunchtime and they have to go. And probably we may actually be able to organize some sort of second series of this kind of talk in the future, because there's a lot to explore in a Japanese cinema. And then I'm quite aware that just sort of showing some Japanese films are not always enough. And then we need to have a sort of insightful discussion conversation is needed. And then today's talk was exactly that. And gather together everybody's knowledge and experience from different walk of life and then career. This talk, session was very interesting. I'm very much appreciate for your time. So thank you so much. I hope every audience enjoyed that conversation. I'm sorry that we couldn't pick up that question posted on the Q&A box. And also appreciate that those people throwing the comments and very constructive comments onto the chat box. And then that was a really interesting session to have a conversation among those audience. I hope you continue to love Japanese cinema and then continue to support the Japan Foundation Touring Film Program, which will come back next year at the same time. So thank you so much for your panel, Julian, James, and then Kimbara-san and Isaka-san, and also Espen, who did a very good job to moderate such a difficult, the juggling with the different kind of opinions. Thank you so much. Your knowledge was very greatly valued. And also, Bethan, thank you so much for your very thorough interpretation. So that's all from me, and please complete the questionnaire. My colleague will send you the link of questionnaire. So it's great to hear what you thought about it. Thank you so much, and have a nice afternoon wherever you are. Bye-bye.